Welcome, everyone. This is Jordan, and I'm the worship pastor here at Trevecca Community Church, and we are so glad that you're here with us today as we hear God's Word. Each week, we stream the service live from the sanctuary just for you. So come along with us now as we grow together and hear what God has to say to us.
Hear the word of the Lord this morning from Exodus 20, 8 through 17. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Matt. Jesus said to his disciples, "Come to me, all you that are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Wow. Jesus said, "Come to me all y'all who are carrying heavy burdens, who are weary, and I will give you rest." To which we responded, "Wow, Jesus, that is so kind, as you always are. Thank you, Jesus. That is such a gracious invitation. I would love to take you up on that. I am down to rest in your presence. That sounds amazing." The thing is, it's not me, it's my boss. It's my boss. You understand how it is, Jesus, with the man upstairs. I mean, you understand, right? Like, it's not me. It's just that if I'm not on email all weekend during this really busy season that we're in and I don't respond, when my boss shoots me an email, it seems like I don't care about what a crazy busy season we're in. And then, there's also my kids, right? Like, it's baseball season, Jesus, which is insane. Saturdays, we're always driving from this place to that. It's real hectic. I mean, it's just a season of life, right, Jesus? It's just a season of life. It's not me. It's the kids. So maybe we can take like a rain check, for later in the month there's Easter, and Jesus, you know that Easter's coming early this month. I know that didn't slip your attention. Easter's coming early, and there's a lot of work to do to get ready for it. I mean, hey, it's your resurrection and all. We're celebrating. It's a big deal. We take Easter seriously. And it's a lot of work to celebrate the family meal. We've got to bring everybody together. I'm going to have to shop for matching outfits for the family. I know you don't care about that, Jesus, but everyone else is going to be dressed up really nice. We'll want to take pictures that day. So that pretty much cancels out March. Let's look at April, Jesus. What's your calendar like for April? Oh, wait, then again, there's also like finals coming up in April. That's when all my really big papers are due. And you give grace, Jesus, but my professors do not. Can I get an amen? So April's looking pretty bad, maybe May. Yeah, maybe we could squeeze it in May, like squeeze in a little resting with you time, because the summer is just bonkers, am I right? You can't schedule anything in the summer. It's just not going to happen. So thank you so much, Jesus. That offer is so kind. We'll get around to it eventually. We've been in this series on Sabbath resistance and talking about the way that accepting Jesus' invitation to rest and really obeying the fourth commandment to honor the Sabbath, to have a day where we just let everything stop. How that helps us to resist the cultures of this world that would form and shape us in the image of idols rather than in the image of Jesus. In fact, we looked last week at the 10 Commandments and how the first 3 commandments are about devotion to God, having no other gods before God, having no idols, and not misusing the name of God. All those first 3 are about devotion to God. And then the 4th commandment that builds a bridge to the rest is this about honoring the Sabbath, keeping it holy, entering into the rhythms of Sabbath rest before we get to the last 6 commandments, which are about care for neighbor. So the 10 Commandments begin with this devotion to God, end with care to neighbor, and the bridge between the two is Sabbath rest, resting. The last 6 that we're going to look at today are about honoring father and mother. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't coveting. I know it sounds all like obvious stuff, right? These commandments that are about care to neighbor sound like really obvious stuff. And you might look at that list and say, what in the world does that have to do with Sabbath? But I've got a few questions for you, just to consider. If you are one who it feels like it's really hard to think about what having a regular rhythm of Sabbath might look like, here's my question. What if, like, how much less work and anxiety might you have if we lived in a world in which children and young people really did honor their father and mother or their elders? And I mean this seriously. Like, if younger folks who have energy and strength did some of the work of caring for family and caring for others that often falls to older members of the family, or younger members of the church who have some strength and energy did some of the work that often falls to older members, or if children didn't create more work for their parents and those that have been given care and charge of them by disregarding boundaries and rules, and if parents didn't have to work so hard to maintain those boundaries and rules because they knew that they weren't going to be transgressed, how much less work would that mean for you? Another question then, how much less work and anxiety would you have in your life if there wasn't any murder? I mean, if we didn't have to worry not just about murder, but perhaps even about the threat of violence? I mean, how much less work would it be if we didn't have to live in a world under the constant threat of violence and worry that somebody was going to use violence against us? What if your workplace didn't have to work out active shooter scenarios? And you could go to the airport without being screened and patted down for guns and bombs? What if our schools were a safe place that we could send our children to without worry of gun violence? And what if you didn't have to protect your home and family against the possibility of violence? If our church didn't have to worry about things like security teams? What if? How much less work and anxiety would you have in your life if that were the case? Well, then let me ask, what if we lived in a world, how much less work and anxiety would you have if you didn't have to worry about adultery? Or maybe even those closest to you breaking covenant with you? If your marriage and your home, your family life felt safe and secure like a bedrock foundation, and you didn't feel like you were constantly under the pressure to hold it all together and to keep everybody happy all the time, if you trusted without a doubt that those covenants would hold for better or for worse, And what if you didn't have to worry about keeping up appearances to try to compete for the eye and affection of those closest to you? What if you didn't have to constantly worry about maintaining skincare and hair care, workout routines, protein shakes, shaving, plucking, makeup, squeezing yourself into a pair of Spanx, trying to capture somebody's eye and keep up with standards of beauty that ignore the reality of human bodies? Because you knew without a doubt that you were loved and valued and that nobody was about to come and take that away from you. How much less work and anxiety would you have in your life? What if you didn't worry about stealing? Somebody else stealing from you. If you didn't have to protect your passwords all the time and change them every month and forget where you wrote them down so you get locked out of your email and now you can't verify. And what if maybe you even succeed at protecting your bank account from somebody else breaking into it, but now you can't remember how to access it and manage it? And what if you didn't have to worry about somebody breaking into your home? If you didn't worry about someone cheating you at work or undervaluing your work? If you didn't have to worry about companies that sign you up for something you didn't know you signed up for, but it's still taking $10 out of your bank account every month, whether you know it or not? What if you didn't have to worry about somebody constantly trying to figure out how to cheat you for $1 here and there, clicking on a spam link that steals your identity and information? What if you didn't have to worry about stealing? How much less work and anxiety would you have in your life then, right? What if you didn't have to worry about being lied to? How much less work and anxiety if you didn't have to worry about being lied to? What if you didn't have to do all the work to verify that the air condition repair company wasn't going to rip you off and tell you you needed something that you didn't really need that was way more expensive than what you could afford? And what if you didn't have to worry about students plagiarizing their paper and hunt down all the possible sources that they could have AI'd that thing into existence? What if you didn't have to do that? What if you didn't have to worry about somebody trying to rip you off? Or what if you didn't have to worry about meeting someone online who wasn't who they say they are? Or worrying about your kids meeting someone online who wasn't who they say they are? And what if you didn't worry about the people closest to you misleading you, concealing important facts? What if you could trust that what you were told the first time was the truth? End of story. How much less work and anxiety would you have? What if we lived in a society that didn't covet? People didn't covet your stuff and you didn't covet theirs. What if we lived in a society where you didn't need to keep up with the latest stuff that your neighbor has and constantly feel like that coworker who got the account that you wanted, well, now they're taking the trip to Hawaii and you're not? I mean, how much more time would you have if you didn't spend any time scrolling through media where you were seeing people doing things that you wish you were doing and wearing things that you wish you were wearing and accomplishing things that you wish you were accomplishing and selfieing in front of their beautiful, spotless kitchens where it looks like no meal has ever been prepared? How much more time would you have? How much less work would you have? I mean, maybe then you could really take a day to just rest. It's hard for us to really practice Sabbath rest because we don't live in a world that follows all those rules, right? That's just the honest truth. We don't live in a world that respects the Ten Commandments and that honors God. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where children and young people often look out for themselves rather than honoring their father and mother and elders. We live in a world where violence is a constant threat, where cheating and adultery is in every movie and TV show that we watch, where we spend so much time and energy protecting against theft of all kinds, and we're so used to being lied to that we're surprised when we find out that someone's telling us the truth, and where we feel the constant tug of resentment over what other people seem to have. We live in an anxious world. In a really anxious society in so many ways, anxiously grasping at more and protecting what we have at all costs. And this is like the world of Pharaoh, like the land of Egypt. You remember at the beginning of the Ten Commandments, it reminds us that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who brought you out of the house of slavery. And so all these 10 commandments are about living free from the slave masters of Egypt. That's what this whole patterning of life is about, being freed from all of that. But in Egypt, it was this place of anxiety and scarcity. Walter Brueggemann writes this about Egypt. He says, there were no neighbors in that system, only threats and competitors. Can you imagine living in that world where everyone is a threat or a competitor? Now, Moses was a man who knew this world all too well. Moses grew up in the very heart of Pharaoh's world, raised in Pharaoh's family in his palace. And so he was right in the thick of it. He was an Egyptian in so many ways, even though he was born a Hebrew. One day he watches an Egyptian slave master beating a Hebrew man. And Moses is watching this happen, and he watches this act of violence and greed, and he snaps. Only he throws himself completely into this land of Egypt that he's been living in. He acts fully like everybody else in the system that he's seeing. He snaps, and he murders the Egyptian slave master, and he hides his body. Moses is now a murderer and a liar. The guy who brought down the 10 commandments about not murdering and lying is now a murderer and a liar. He hides the body. It isn't until Moses sees the very worst that Egypt could be. Or actually, it isn't even until Moses becomes the very worst that Egypt could be that he has to get out. He has to escape. He flees and he runs out into the wilderness to get away from it all. He has to get out of this violent, lying, stealing, idolatrous culture, and he runs away. You know, sadly for many of us, we don't seek out real rest and Sabbath in a serious way until we've already seen the very worst of what can happen when we don't ever let ourselves stop. Often this is the case. We don't even think about really taking time for that until after the breakdown, until after the affair, until after the arrest, until after the overdose, until after the sickness, until after life in the brickyard collapses in on you, that you finally go looking for another way to live. And that's what happens to Moses. Less dramatically, perhaps, maybe you're just at a place where you truly get to rest only when you're sick. Maybe this is not the case for anybody else, but I remember the first time I got COVID was in February of 2021, right before vaccines were available to my age group. And that first time was awful. I had to quarantine for 10 days. Symptoms were really bad. Ended up in the hospital for a day. It was not fun. It was scary. It did not feel like Sabbath rest whatsoever. But the second time I got it, after me and my whole family was vaccinated and we were told that y'all can't leave your house for 10 days, it was like, all right, staycation. Let's watch some movies. I mean, not really, but kind of. Anybody ever feel like that? Like the only times you get to rest are when you're sick? I mean, how out of control is your life if you think the only way you can get a break is by getting sick? You go licking like doorknobs and stuff, right? And I know for some of you, even when you do get sick, you don't get to take a break. Because we can't do this alone. This kind of life with God is not something we can do on our own because we live in an anxious world. We live in an anxious culture that doesn't follow the 10 Commandments. We can't do this on our own. We will just chase after whatever the communities around us tell us is good, even if it's killing us. So we need community to tell us a different story. See, this practice of Sabbath resists a culture of anxiety by entering deeply into community. And not just any kind of community, a community that is a worshiping community that's been set free from the anxious culture of the old life. See, Moses was raised in the heart of Egypt. He was raised in the very thick of life in Egypt, and he finds that he's become the worst of what Egypt can produce. And so he flees into the wilderness, into the land of Midian. And there he finds these 7 daughters who are out trying to water their flock, but these shepherds are trying to stop them. And so Moses essentially defends the women against these shepherds and helps them water their flocks. It's an act of kindness that he didn't have to do. It's an act of kindness that he wasn't ordered to do by a slave master, that he didn't get paid to do. There was no transaction for this act of kindness that he performs in the wilderness. And so these daughters, they run home and they tell their father about this man who helped him for no reason. Here's how that dialogue goes in Exodus chapter 12. They said to their father, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." And then he said to his daughters, "Well, where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." And so Moses agreed to stay with the man. And he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." It's so interesting to me that they introduce Moses as an Egyptian. He's grown up in Egypt, and so even though he's actually a Hebrew, he's one of God's people, he probably looks, acts, sounds like an Egyptian. I mean, he's so deeply formed and shaped in that culture, in that system, that this is the way that he's introduced. But then he's introduced into this community that invites him to come and break bread with them. And so he enters into this home and he breaks bread with them, and they make him a part of the family. He becomes a part of their family, enters into this different kind of community where there is no slave master. There's a priest and there's some shepherds and there's a balance of rest and work. And he realizes here in the wilderness, when he's finally gotten out of Egypt, this is where he realizes that he was a stranger in a foreign land in Egypt. After being introduced as an Egyptian, he realizes that that's actually where he was an alien and a stranger. Almost as if he's saying, here in the wilderness is where I'm at home. It seems that here in the Midian camp, Moses discovers a new way of life. And before he can lead the people of Israel into a new way of life, before he leads the people of Israel through the Red Sea into the wilderness, Moses has to experience this for himself. Here he learns how to be a shepherd. He learns these rhythms of living and worshiping that are not set by the slave master's whip. Moses experiences life outside the brickyard. And it's interesting to me that this kind of life in the Midian camp is what he comes to want for the people of God. You know, Moses didn't grow up as a slave in Egypt. Moses grew up in the palace of the son, as the son of a princess in Egypt. He had a good life, but even that good life in Egypt is not what he wants for the people of God. Even that kind of good life. He doesn't just want for the people of God to throw off the chains of slavery just so they can move into the palace and become the new slave master. And that's not what God wants for the Hebrew people either. And Moses has experienced something that is altogether outside of that system of slavery and oppression. He's discovered something completely other in the wilderness. Friends, I'm pretty convinced that you cannot lead people somewhere that you have not been. I mean, not really, like not deeply. We often, you are people of influence in some way, shape, or form. You are people with influence, parents or grandparents, employers, friends, neighbors. And you cannot lead people somewhere you have not been. But the catch seems to be that in order to get there, we kind of need others to go with us. We can't really go alone. And as I was praying about it this week, it felt like this chicken or egg scenario, right? So which is it? Do we go off on our own or do we go in community? How do we do this? Moses, I often think about as this great leader who leads the people into the unknown. But actually, he was welcomed into the wilderness first and had a community that he experienced this with. He experienced in the Midian community what this life could be like. It is hard to practice Sabbath in a culture that is so very anxious. In a culture where we are worried all the time about our children and young people, about violence and adultery and stealing and lying, and there's so much coveting constantly in our faces. And we can't single-handedly change all the systems. We can't even probably single-handedly change our home life. We can't do this on our own, but what if? What if just for one day, we could step out of the anxious system, discover what life was like outside and a part of that? What if just for one day, we could let it all stop? That would mean that for that one day, we are also not contributing to the anxious system, and we make it easier for other people to stop and to rest, for the community to participate in this Sabbath. Like, what if just for one day of the weekend, you were not on email, and that actually lowered the volume of email in your workspace? Or what if just for one day you did not make to-do lists of all the chores that need to be done, and you decided not to be stressed about housework so your kids and family could also not worry about those things and not be stressed as well? Or what if for one day, you were not on social media scrolling the news feed and posting pictures about your brilliant thought or your perfect life so that other people didn't have to see and covet you having brilliant thoughts and a perfect life, and you didn't have to see their perfect life either, just for one day? Or for one day, you stop scrolling the news feed or keeping up with all the cable news networks and the news podcasts and all the ways to get the news. Just for one day, you didn't participate in that anxious cycle of the news media, and maybe even just as one little person who decides to tune out of it for one day, that maybe it lets the networks and the advertisers know that at least there's this one person who for one day does not need a constant stream of high anxiety news stories running 24/7. Or what if for one day, you're not out driving around to this appointment and to that store and to this meeting so that for one day there is a tiny bit less exhaust fumes in the atmosphere so that your neighbor can breathe easier and the trees don't have to work quite so hard for one day? Or for one day, you and your family commit to not arguing, to not having the hard conversations. Not that you don't have the hard conversations, but one day that you're not going to bring up the stuff. You're not going to point out the flaws so that the people who you love and live with can rest from the anxiety of wondering when the next big argument will break loose. For one day. You see, when you practice Sabbath, you make it a little bit easier for others around you to also accept the invitation of Jesus to lay down their heavy burdens and receive his rest. When you step out of the anxious system that our world lives in for one day, you take that power out of the anxious system and you trust in the power of God who parts the waters and sets people free. Last week, we quoted Adele Calhoun, who said, "If you're not resting, you're a slave to something." I'm just curious, how did that set with you? If you're not resting, you're a slave to something. Jesus is calling. Come to me, all. Not just some, not just the privileged few who really have their lives together, not just the ones who can afford it. Come all who are weary and heavy burdened, and he will give you rest. Trevecca Community Church, I have seen you. I have watched you care for other people so very well. You care about other people being able to rest when they need it. In fact, I am frequently amazed at this congregation, how well you do this. When someone is sick, you make sure that they don't have to worry about meals and sometimes even house cleaning. You care for them so that they can rest. I've watched you do it. It's awesome. When new parents bring home a new baby, you make casseroles and you make sure that they can rest. I've watched you take care of single parents, making sure that they've got help so that they can have some days that they don't have to be a caretaker and they can rest. I have watched you in so many ways, even just this last week. I watched Pete Wise and David Harris show up figuring out how to work a really weird coffee maker system so that we could welcome 14 of our unhoused guests for the night as they served as innkeepers so that those guys could have a safe place to rest. And I also know that means that Melanie and Maddie were taking care of little kids by themselves so that those guys could rest. I know you care about this. I know you care about this for other people, and you want those in your life and in our neighborhood and community to experience the rest that Jesus gives. My question for you is, do you feel like you are worthy of that rest too? That Jesus wants you. Like Jesus really wants to be with you, to have your full attention. I mean, do you believe that? That you are worth it? And that maybe even you stepping out of it all, letting it all stop to just spend some real devoted time with the Father, that maybe that is actually the best way to lead others into that rest too. The band's going to come up and they're going to lead us in a song that has this refrain about resting in the Father's hands. And as you hear this, let's let this just be our response today. These words that we sing back to God, may this be our yes to Jesus' invitation. Come to me. All y'all, come to me. If you are weary, if your burdens are heavy, come to me and I will give you rest. Let this be your yes to Jesus, not your rain check. Whatever that can look like for you today, as we sing and respond, let's accept the invitation of Jesus to rest in his presence. The altars are open if you'd like to come and rest here or where you are at home or in the sanctuary. Let's accept the invitation that Jesus is giving to you today.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember, you can join us in person in the sanctuary at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings, live on YouTube or through our sermon podcast. If you'd like to give, you can do so at trevecca.church/give. Any other ministry resources can be found on our website. However you join us, however you choose to engage, know that you are loved. We're grateful for you.